Buenas tardes, bienvenidos una vez más al canal de YouTube del Instituto Cervantes de Manchester y Leeds. Welcome to the Instituto Cervantes Manchester and Leeds YouTube channel. First of all, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our guests, Professor Eugenia Afinoguénova and Professor Rosi. Thank you very much for joining us in our second event on 2022 of our series Ex Libris, Publications in Hispanic Studies. This series is coordinated with Professor Rosi from the University of Durham, where she is also the Deputy Head of the School of Modern Languages. In this series, we discuss the recent work on the topic of contemporary Hispanic culture in British and American academia. I will introduce our host. Dr. Rosi has published many works on contemporary Spanish culture, film, and literature. Some of her works include Lost in Transition, Constructing Memory in Contemporary Spain, A Taste of Barcelona, The History of Catalan Cooking and Eating as co-author, and also Traces of Contamination, Unearthing the Francoist Legacy in Contemporary Spanish Discourse. Finally, she has also published Towards a Cultural Archive of La Movida as co-editor. Her articles have appeared in the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies, MLN, Revista de Estudios Hispánicos, Romance Notes, Hispamérica, Revista Iberoamericana, and Hispania, among many others. And now I introduce our special guest. Today is Dr. Eugenia Afinoguénova, who is professor of Spanish and Hispanic culture of Marquette University in Milwaukee. She is co-editor of Spain is Still Different, Tourism and Discourse in Spanish Identity, and the author of El Idiota Superviviente, Artes y Letras Españolas frente a la muerte del hombre, 1969-1990. Well, today our discussion will center on the launch of the Afinoguénova's book, The Prado, Spanish Culture and Leisure, 1939, an excellent work that has become a reference for all of us and that won the prestigious 2019 Eleanor Tufts Award from the American Society of Hispanic Art Historical Studies. Thank you, Rosi. Thank you, Eugenia. It's a great pleasure to have you tonight to present this excellent book, which is much more than a history of the Prado Museum. It takes an unconventional look at the Spanish most iconic museum, focusing on the Prado as a space of human leisure. The author highlights the political history of the museum's relations to the monarchy, the church, the liberal state, nation state, as well as the role and extension of Madrid's social center, the Prado Promenade, El Paseo del Prado. Rather than assume that visitors agreed about how to interpret the museum, the author approaches the history of the Prado as a debatable cultural and leisure. And what can we say? What can I say as a Spaniard about the Prado? The Prado is one of the most important galleries art galleries in the world, has a very special significance for Spanish people that goes far beyond the treasure it holds. And is one of the most important, just to say, John Eliot, who unfortunately passed away very recently, and who was also very committed to cooperating with Instituto Cervantes. Eliot said that the history of Spain is intimately linked to the history of the Prado, constantly illuminating each other. So thank you very much to you. Thank you to our audience for being tonight with us. At the end of the talk between Eugenia and Rosi, we will have a question and answer time, like 15 minutes, If you have questions to the author or any comments, you can put it on the chat, and I will then ask Eugenia. Without further ado, thank you very much again, and I give the floor to Professor Rosi. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Pedro Jesus. Thank you, Instituto Cervantes, Manchester, to host us once again for the series Ex Libris. And thank you so much, Eugenia, for joining us today. It's such a delight to be able to invite you and to host you in this space to talk about your amazing book. I was telling everyone that my mind has been buzzing since I finished reading your book with so many ideas, so many stories. And indeed, what an important place, and how so many stories that are linked through that space, through that institution. So I hope we do a little bit of justice to the amazing work that you've done. And also to commemorate the publication of the book in paperback, and also that is being translated into Spanish. Thank you so much, Eugenia, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Rosi. Before I continue, I would like to thank Instituto Cervantes Manchester, and especially the director, Pedro Jesus Eusebio Cuesta, for being my generous host and for doing a great introduction and even pronouncing my first name and last name correctly. I also would like to thank Carlos Pulpillo, who is not here today, but who was the gestor cultural behind the process of bringing me virtually to Manchester in a way. And of course, Rosi Song, a valued, wonderful colleague, for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. So let's jump right in, because there is so much to discuss, and I know that you and I would be selecting a little some questions that we could discuss today, sort of tease out some of the important stories that you tell. So maybe we can start today with one question that you actually posed in your introduction, and I believe this question was given to you by one of your colleagues as well, and I thought it was a very clever question, and it sets up the stage for your book. So the question goes, a history of a museum, what is the history of, really? And there are so many histories and stories that you tell in this book. So I wanted to start our discussion asking you, how would you describe the thread you follow in this book? Because formally, it seems to follow a chronology or a historical chronology, but it's really quite not organized chronologically, because there are a lot of stories that come in and out, they're weaved through. So how would you describe the thread of your book?
Thanks, Rosi. This is a great starting point, the question about what does museum history tell us? And I want to be clear, there are multiple histories of the Prado, and they inspired me. There is an excellent story of the origins of the Prado by Pedro Berocchi, who was the first archivist of the Prado, who worked and plowed really through the royal archives in the 1920s. Then the two museum directors, Francisco Javier Sanchez Canton and late Alfonso Perez Sanchez, wrote their histories of the Prado, one in the 1940s and the other in the 1970s. And then art historians such as, for example, Juan Antonio Gaya Nuño wrote his well-researched history of the Prado. What happened, in my opinion, was that these histories of the Prado treated the museum as if it were like a royal court or a state of sorts. So there were leaders, the museum directors who had agency, and there was this progressive history of unfolding or development, which was pretty much like amassing the national riches, right? And then the passive subjects of the action of the museum directors were the paintings that the directors had to administer, protect, locate in place, organize by regions, etc. And this kind of story was useful, but that was not the story that I wanted to tell. When I realized that that wasn't a story that I wanted to tell is when I actually rewrote the whole manuscript that was done from the institutional point of view. In the final product that took more than 10 years, I treat the museum as a vehicle, or like a special type of vehicle, which is a time machine. So this is a place that takes us right to the center of the action at any historical point since the early 19th century, at least. And the action was happening on many fronts simultaneously. So it's a good question what exactly the book is about. Yes, the outline is chronological, and it starts at the foundation of the museum after the Napoleonic Wars in 1819. Then the museum is nationalized under the First Republic after the dethronement of Isabel II in 1868. And then I take the story through the end of the Civil War. Each of these chapters starts with the political overview of the situation, how it looked from the window of my time machine. And then I continue, I go on, and I tell what people in other countries thought about art museums, because the story of the Prado is never the story of just Spain. Museums were actually competing with each other and even spying on each other's, borrowing each other's exhibition techniques. They needed to be the main museums of the world, each of them separately. And that happened throughout the 19th, and in fact, it happens nowadays in a less explicit ways, but I needed to show that the museums were also projects or experiments with organizing the exhibitions, and the Prado was just one of the threads in this ongoing dialogue. And then in the center, at the very center of my research, is really the story of the perceptions of the people who were coming to the museum. And at a certain point, I found out that they were not necessarily well versed in art. Some of them were illiterate. In fact, the majority were illiterate, and I will tell about this later. And so again, I place my time machine and I try to see what they see, and I try to hear what they hear, because we don't have any written sources, or very, very few written sources about the museum. And that was the challenge that I had to face, finding ways of uncovering their reactions. And this is how my story of the Prado, in fact, became the story of the museum gaze that was developed in Spain at the intersection between the popular ways of seeing that were trained at the fairgrounds, in the street, at the theater, at the bullfighting arenas, and so on, and then the aesthetic gaze, the properly museum gaze as we think about it now.
This your comment about the time capsule, it really is indeed, it describes very well what happens in each section and each chapter, actually. And you do weave some of, a story from the institutional point, the point of view of a visitor, what was happening inside and outside, actually, of the building of the museum. And so before we start with the history or the origins of the museum, can we start with the consideration of the location and the space of the museum? Because it is really important in your book. And I know that we're going to go back to this point. I want to go back. So can you briefly explain why you spend time locating this space, and you do make the distinction between the Prado and the Paseo, right, del Prado. So you can be a brief now if you want, because we're going to talk about this again. But I think that you'd be really useful for our listeners today to know why space and location is important for your project.
Yeah, thank you for this. In fact, the museum, the word museum is not even mentioned in the title of my book. So the book is called The Prado, Spanish Culture and Leisure. And I will say leisure, so apologies. I know the British way of saying it is leisure. I am speaking American at this point, Russian American. So I will say leisure, and I hope everybody understands me. So for me, the Prado was this manifold of the experiences inside the museum and outside the museum. And they were continuously influencing each other. So it's not only a story of civilization that brought people away from the street into the museum to admire real works of art. Rather, my story is precisely the story of this museum gaze that was slowly evolving from many sources. And for that, I need to very closely look at what was happening around the museum. Mm-hmm. And that was changing throughout the 120 years that I am examining here. When the museum was just founded, it wasn't what we imagine it now. And I don't know how well my listeners know Madrid, but there is a thing called El Paseo del Arte right now, which is an equivalent of the Magnificent Mile in Chicago and other places. However, so that is the boulevard, the Paseo del Prado, right? And the Paseo del Arte connects three museums, Thyssen-Bornemisza, the Prado, and Museo Nacional Centro del Arte Reina Sofía. When the Prado was founded, that was the outskirts of Madrid, and that was a rustic place. I found the laws from the early 19th century that explicitly prohibit hunting on the Paseo del Prado or bringing small animals to graze from the grass. People could not bring firearms and shoot birds. They could not steal the branches from the tree. And if we think that that was just the dark 19th century, actually the rules and laws well through the 1905, when the zone was, as we now would say, gentrified, these rules repeated. And so in 1905, I found a project for embellishing the Paseo del Prado that included putting a little fence around the fountains to prevent people from bathing there. So this was this type of place where the Prado emerged, and it changed very much as we know it. And my story of the museum is also the story of its changing surroundings.
Yes, in fact, I had to go back to your map and really try to place myself in today's location and the entrance to the museum. And I think that all of those ways in which the institution right now was faced or oriented really is part of the story that you tell. In thinking about orientation and origins, one of the early stories that you tell, of course, is sort of the origin of the museum. And actually you explore or you tell the story of the link between the monarchy and present the museum in a way as a legacy, right? That the monarchy wanted to establish, perhaps thinking about its own representation or its own connection with people. So I wanted to ask you, why do you think that this was, the Prado as a museum was such an important project for Fernando IV, and perhaps more politically significant later for his daughter Isabel II, or even King Alfonso XIII, who is the monarch with whom you sort of end the story of El Prado?
Yeah, thanks for bringing this up, Rosi. You know, nowadays we presume that museums were valued for the art experiences that they offered, but not only for the lower class visitors, but also for the upper class visitors and the owners. Museums were not about art. Richard Ford, the greatest 19th century authority on all things Spanish, hated Ferdinand IV, who was the founder of the Prado. Richard Ford called Ferdinand IV as the like the ugliest goth that ever smoked tobacco, something like that. So he gossiped that Ferdinand only decided to create an art museum because he had a wife, which is true, Isabel I. Isabel de Braganza, I'm really sorry. And Isabel de Braganza conspired to find a place for the paintings because Fernando was dumping them in some dark corner after he decided to refurbish his palaces with the fashionable French wallpaper. So this was, of course, an exaggeration, but it also was true that the king did not found the museum because he loved art. The museum provided an opportunity to stage rituals of power, right? A photo opportunity, we would say now, except for instead of the photos, the kings and queens loved to be mentioned in the newspapers or in the travel books as the owners or providers or guarantors of these beautiful spaces. That was part of the power. That was also part, or rather a measure of a nation's worth. And the museum directors aptly used this in order to get the funding to maintain the museum that was very scarce, especially during Isabel II's rule. There was this discourse in the letters between los mayordomos, who were formerly overseeing the Prado, and the directors. And every time the directors needed some money, they would write to mayordomos that they had to communicate to Her Majesty that she was giving her care to the young artists. So it was this maternal role that was somewhat imposed on the Queen through the mediation of the young artists who were coming to Her Majesty's Art Museum. And of course, these directors needed money, so they would need to remind that the Prado was the best museum of the world, while they also did some, veiled hints about other kings that provided more care for the museums, because really the history of the museum was the history of underfunding that is still continuing, of everything being recycled or reused, which was the tradition of the really poor Spanish court. And that was a story of the owners of the museum that frequently did not know what they had there.
Yeah, and despite actually this interest, or at least the interest that the directors were trying to build around the museum, you actually do note that both Ferdinand and Isabel only visited the museum a couple of times in their lifetime. So, and some of the exhibits had to be delayed because they had to come and inaugurate them, and they would not make space in their calendar. So that was really interesting to read. So speaking about that, trying to convince or trying to make the monarchs either give money, because I think that another big element of the discussion in your book is actually the finances of the museum, right? So who has or owns or things that owns these paintings, these works of art, how they're commercially valued, and so on. But along those lines of administration, there is this desire of what the directors or the people invested in the museum think the museum is for. And I think you already hinted, right? Or is this for didactic purposes to train new artists? Is this for the people to come and enjoy whatever that the space is providing them? And you actually engage in a lot of discussion about display, about the notion of school, and how challenging it is to actually showcase what one would think is national or most valuable for a place, a country, a nation, a monarchy, right? So these time moments in which Spain defines itself as, you know, as a nation, as a monarchy, or as a modern city, right? So they all change. So can you discuss a little bit about these strategies, right, in place in the museum and its relationship with art?
Yeah, thanks for this, Rosi. You know, one of the joys of being a cultural historian is that you never see things as set, but rather as always evolving. And so nowadays we think that museum displays have always been like that, somewhat boring, to some people at least, very dignified, with everything well ordered and marked. However, as I write at some point, the way of displaying paintings and organizing them on the walls was actually a series of shots in the dark, because nobody knew how to display art in the 19th century. There were precedents, and I studied them. I'm not going to repeat them here, but the greatest challenge for the early public museums, especially the post-Napoleonic public museums, was that they had to provide this some kind of blueprint for national time and space. And in Spain, obviously, that was a challenge, because there were multiple artistic traditions of artists who did not travel and did not communicate with each other, and hence they did not learn from each other at the national level. Yet the museum was supposed to encapsulate a united territory, first of a monarchy and later of a state, modern Spanish state. And now we would find this strange, but passions were really running high in the letters of the museum directors and the mayordomos mayores and other intellectuals who participated in this enterprise of consolidating what is now called a Spanish School of Art. And there were people who were fighting with each other and using very strong terms, just to say that it is very important for the country to create this image of a unified artistic tradition. And then that was the challenge of the space. And then there was also the challenge of a timeline of time, because if you look at the art history, it was clear for everybody that, you know, art had its better moments, its golden age, and then it stopped having these great moments. And by the, you know, except for Goya, by perhaps the early 19th century, it was actually in decline. So it was the timeline normally would be a timeline of a melancholy, of a loss of an artistic tradition, but a museum needed to show something progressive and optimistic. And hence the solutions were like, and found heuristics for how to resolve this problem. One solution that was offered in the art museums of the Baroque courts was this idea of creating a space where artists could come to learn from the old masters. So that would be a space that would not be optimistic, it would not be a story of an unfolding progress, but one could see the decline and then learn from old masters and then bring this flourishing back. And so that was one of the ideas behind the use of the art museum for copying paintings. And I dedicate a lot of pages to studying the practices of copying, the rules, who was admitted, what women could copy and what they couldn't, and things like that. So that was one way of addressing the issue of time. What rather happened at the Prado was that the timeline chose was genealogical and retrospective. And just to explain briefly, a visitor would usually come through the northern entrance, which is now the Goya doors, the Goya entrance at the north. And people would first face the latest exhibition. So the exhibit, so the room full of works of recently dead or still living artists that usually had works that just glorified the Bourbon's monarchy, and some not significant works by Goya, or some not landscapes, even some still lifes. So that was like bad art compared to the rest of the collection. But then as people would progress in their own personal experience, what is called the march, the march at the museum, they would see better and better and better art. So this way, even though the actual timeline, the chronology was backward, it could not show any greater success. The personal experience of any visitor was positive and optimistic, because at the end there was better art. And there were other ways that I describe of rearranging the exhibits that happened.
Yeah, so that is interesting to think about the idea that by going in a way backwards, right, you're seeing sort of the masterworks, but also the optimism. That's a very interesting way of describing it. But also speaking about optimism, or perhaps understanding or not understanding what the visitors were seeing in the museum. And actually some of the comments that you recover from people just commenting about their experience of visiting the museum, perhaps not artist students, perhaps not people interested in copying these works, but, you know, people that have just visited because the Prado is there. I've seen that, I've done it, you know, in a way, almost like when we visit a city and we visit a museum, I'm like, yeah, I've been to X museum, and that's sort of like a box that you check. So let's think a little bit about that, you know, museum leisure, and take it outside of El Prado again. You discuss a lot about the space, the control of the space, where the Prado is, and think about the concept of leisure for people. What should they have access to? And in a way, the space that cities and urban planners provide. And there's a lot of controlling there as well. But there's also people's agency or what gets done. And I wanted you to explain your interest in the verbenas that are taking place around the museum, right? Because I think those festivities are very important in the story that you tell about the museum, and especially one of the festivities, the San Isidro, which is actually the one that Madrid just celebrated recently, right? So can you explain a little bit more about the verbenas?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks for bringing the leisure, right, which is the second, and to me, one of the more interesting part of the story, because it's been less researched. So thanks for this, Rosi. Yeah, so verbenas are the celebrations of the San Isidro, as you said, and they have a long tradition. Of course, it's pagan and semi-pagan, but with time, all urban fairgrounds involving nightly gatherings became known as the verbenas. So the San Isidro verbena is like the original one that has to do with the summer solstice, of course, and things like that. It was also the time when you could hire and fire servants. And so servants could actually lodge or sleep or camp on the Paseo del Prado around the museum. And that was a part of these nightly celebrations of the involving San Isidro. The two frameworks of my research come not from Spain. So I study the system of urban leisure from the point of view of Peter Bailey, who studied the emergence of this, what he calls leisure zone, which is the system of gated sites that charge admission fees, and that the urban bourgeois were using in order to separate themselves from the non-paying masses or the middle classes that they considered to be less distinguished. So this is Peter Bailey's theory of leisure zone. And the other theory is the idea of the sort of civilizing process and the sportization of leisure. And that has to do with this usage of urban pastimes as a system of activities and norms that have to do with needing a control for urban lower class or middle lower class populations. So they would gradually evolve from unruled, ungoverned activities into this politicized, again, confined in time and space and rules-governed activities. So against this background, the history of the fairgrounds in Madrid is fascinating because San Isidro, that you, Rosi, mentioned, initially developed mostly by the Manzanares River. The listeners of this talk might remember Goya's famous panorama of the Manzanares, where people would come and picnic and eat and drink and lay down and then drink again. And then at night, they would come to the Prado Museum. And initially, these were like two realms. One was the museum and these nightly gatherings of people who were déclassés, and then the urban leisure by the Manzanares River. What happened, however, is that, as I found out, when the museum was being nationalized, which was roughly the years of Alfonso XII, so restoration time, these two areas began to converge because what the bourgeois of Madrid did was to migrate away from those unruled activities by the Manzanares River to the urban spaces of the Paseo del Prado, where gated sites were erected. And so eventually, instead of changing or sort of civilizing, right, as Edgar Elias would say, the leisure, what happened is that satellite activities and commercial entertainment moved to the Paseo del Prado and was settled around the Prado Museum. And if I may, I would like to just share one map. I have many images, so just bear with me if you can for 1 second. I have the right to share, and I will try to do it. So you see my slide, right? Just the title of the book at this point. Okay, I'm going to run through some of the slides because I prepared more than I needed, but, and we can return to them later on. But so this is the Plano de Madrid from 1883 that I wanted to share with you. And it showed all these gated bourgeois activities marked in capital letters, and I named some. So there were a circus, there were Jardines del Buen Retiro, which now doesn't exist. This is where the Palacio de Comunicaciones now stands, and that's where the government of Madrid resides right now. But back then there was a place with a gated area and a theater. So the museum is number 1, of course, right? So that's further north. And then by the Plaza de la Lealtad, there is this semicircular square, and you see just a cluster of those gated activities that are marked, and they are between the circus, a panorama of Tetuan, which is the panorama of Battle of Tetuan, after Fortun's work that was kept in Barcelona. And then there were, and then right by the museum, right by the entrance, there was the so-called exhibition of wild beasts by Monsieur Beidel. And there were actually beasts. So the term museum, the term exhibition had many meanings, and a lot of them had to do with this developing, mushrooming sites of bourgeois entertainment. And then I will just share a couple of more images. That did not mean that if the museum was a part of this cluster, people who were coming there and who wanted to be more distinguished knew how to look at the paintings. And so again, my story of the museum is the story of the museum gaze. And what was happening inside the museum is, again, not what we usually expect, because what one could see the bodies of the dead museum directors exhibited, and then the works by Velázquez and Murillo arranged in an improvised altar around the coffin, and then later on, fast forward to 1930, and we see this word again, artístico, pabellón artístico, is a part of the verbena, right, of the fairground, right near the museum, captured by Licencia de la Verbena. And then going back, I have this one image. This is again 1935, and this is La Verbena a las puertas del museo. So this is a verbena, this point, this is a merry-go-round, right by the southern entrance of the museum. So all these bourgeois leisure sites never really left the area until Franco's times.
Right. So these, in that combination of pictures, you just basically showed how sort of that display, that exuberance of sort of that popular, force comes into the museum, and then actually the Pabellón Artístico goes and joins the fair in a way. So I think there's so many instances in which you really display this cultural analysis of that time at that moment and the people involved in the history of Spain that is quite amazing. So informative and erudite. Again, Eugenia, it's such an amazing book. And speaking about what people see and they control, and I know we're running out of time, and I do want to leave time for people to ask, but so I'm not going to talk about sort of the huge role that nude paintings play in your book, because you constantly discuss them. And it was an amazing thread to follow in the book. But let's bring the story of the museum closer to our present. And the last chapter of your book talks about saving the Prado's collection. And this is a moment where the country is at war. And I know that some of these stories have been recovered and been in the news recently. But I wanted to hear from you as you were moving that museum into sort of the present, and at a moment of upheaval, violence, and suffering, why saving these works of art mattered, right? Because at the beginning, it's even unclear if the works of art matter or not, or why should they matter, right? And suddenly at the end of the book, they become very important players in the history of the country and its own sense of identity and tradition. So what were you interested in telling sort of that last chapter of your book?
Thanks for this, and thanks for bringing it closer to our times, Rosi. I will try to be brief, and then maybe if people have questions, they can ask them. We think that art collections are unfailable and everybody needs to protect them. However, recent experiences and also the experiences previous the Franco-Prussian War of 1871 showed that the museums are often among the first victims of any war. And there were efforts at the early 20th century to secure a special status for monuments and museums, but the first documents were not ratified when the Spanish Civil War breaks out. There is a heavy bombing of the area of the Paseo, but then it also turns out that the heavy bombing actually happened after the paintings were taken away to Valencia. There was a very well-prepared operation in the early days of November of 1936 of taking, without any reporting, taking the museum out, the best paintings of the collection out of the building and moving them to Valencia. And then on November 16th, there is a bombing, and then when the paintings are already there, they are saved and rescued. And there is a lot of research about this. I will just say two things. For my story of the Prado as this museum without walls, The idea of an art collection that becomes everybody's treasure as it is saved and moved somewhere, because later on, as Valencia was in danger, the collection had to be taken to Barcelona, to the Franco-Prussian border, and then eventually it would end up in Geneva, right? And then be returned back. So this story that made people physically participating in the story of the works of art as objects had to do a lot with these very people understanding the value of art. And that seems paradoxical, and however, this is what it is. So the museum is not a set of ideas, it is also a set of physical objects that need to be rescued. And I will end by saying that the history of the rescue of the collection, first of all, there is a lot of conspiracy around it, but actually the Prado was not unique. The Basque government and the Catalan government did the same by trying to, and by actually successfully taking away its collections in 1936 to France. And so probably, even though we don't know it for sure, the idea was similar, and these works returned and they were protected. There was an idea of one people of the Popular Front that were the people of France and Spain. So it only made sense for these people to have the museum, collection that is not the same as the former site where the museum was. And so this experience also became an example of rescuing a museum collection that was used during World War II in France and also in the Soviet Union. And I will stop here.
Thank you. I forgot to ask our audience members to start typing questions in our chat box before I ask that last question to save some time. So please go ahead, ask questions. I am happy to read them to Eugenia as we discuss. So while we give them some minutes, perhaps we can go back a little bit to the nudes, because this is a fascinating story that you tell. Can you share a little bit of what was happening with the nude pictures, the paintings? It was all about control.
Yeah, and actually a lot of, so we think like, yes, museums is where nudes belong. However, a lot of social reformers and bourgeois educators had to normalize the presence of the nudes in the Prado, and nobody felt really at ease seeing them. And I will just share a few caricatures of the time while people are writing. Again, apologies if...
Yeah, actually, somebody have asked to see some of the slides. So maybe you want to go through them.
Yeah. So I have way too many, but that's why the book exists. But these are just some good snapshots that show how people could react. And so what I say is that, again, the museum gaze emerges somewhere between this fairground stare, as Rosalind Garland Thompson typifies it, right? It's looking how you're not supposed to look, looking where you're not supposed to look at. I do not treat these caricatures as just portraits of lower class visitors. I think that these artists actually captured and projected onto the lower class visitors their own uncertainties as to what to do in the museum. And so this is, I just love that, que vergüenza, what a shame. And this is why people go to Madrid. And then we think that, okay, that all ended with the dark 19th century, but then this is 1935. And we see actually the same, edge behind these boys looking at Danaeus. And then I'll go a little bit earlier, and my apologies. This is like my starting point, right? There's a lot of gender dynamics too. Who is supposed to look where and when? So we see a daughter and the mother says, Conchita, baja los ojos, cast your eyes down. And Conchita says, yeah, I already saw that I wasn't supposed to look. And then we see a male a male character who is looking perfectly, right? And he very closely actually examining something, etc., etc. And the same actually happened. So people would come to look at nudes and feel the frisson, right, the thrill, but then they would also look at each other. And, you know, this, again, as the museum was a place of intergender, interclass, intersex mingling that created a lot of funny stories about how the museums could have been perceived.
Yeah, actually, we have a comment from Rebecca Ingram that was curious about gender dynamics. So she thanks you for mentioning that. Do you want to talk a little bit more about gender dynamics that was happening in the museum? And I think that you also tell some interesting anecdotes. For example, Emilia Pardo Bazán trying to gain access to the museum to copy paintings herself.
Yeah, no, Emilia Pardo Bazán actually was copying. So I think her father was, he was at the first post-revolutionary Cortes of 1868. And so she was with her mother at the Prado, and I found her signature copying paintings. We do not know what she copied, but there are, because the permissions to copy had to be officially solicited, they give us interesting information about the rights of women. So on the one hand, every person going into the museum had to sign this guest book, right, showing the name, address, and profession. And I found some women, but not many people, many women were Spaniards. There were a lot of foreign women, not a lot, right? And again, I have some statistics, so it's usually like 1/10, right, among the copyists, people who were copying and people who were visiting. But then I found, for example, a woman that was coming from Valencia, and she was a daughter of somebody who had a factory of making lace, right? Lace maker of Valencia. And so she, I'm sure, came to admire and maybe get inspired by the lace works on the royal portraits. So there are all these stories. I have the statistics of how many women copyists were coming through time to visit. It was interesting that women had to present a letter of recommendation from somebody, right? Either a teacher or a husband or whoever, while men didn't have to. Yeah.
And then actually you take that story closer to the moments before the Spanish Civil War. And you do mention the group of women artists, now more known as the generation of Las Sin Sombrero, right? So what changes in that moment, do you think?
Well, okay, that's a great question. So the so-called right women of generation of 27, they were still under the tutelage of somebody like Jose Ortega y Gasset. However, I think that the experience of these urban fairgrounds, that in the end, as I argue, did not evolve into the strictly speaking bourgeois gated regulated leisure, but rather presented them some hybrid phenomenon of everything. So as La Esencia de la Verbena, right, as somebody, I think it's Gomez de la Serna speaking in the background, right, saying that this is a place where nobody judges anybody. So this kind of feeling of the place of meeting each other was developed at the urban fairgrounds and then somehow applied to the paintings that represented it. And I cite Maruja Malo and Maruja Mayo, right, and her fairground series, especially. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that one of the paintings that you include in your book is actually really captures sort of that mix of what's going on in those spaces. And I was actually taken by the significance of the painting after reading your book. Actually, I mean, I was familiar with the painting, but your analysis actually infused it with so much more meaning. So thank you for that. Do we have any more questions? I'm seeing that the chat is empty, but if you, okay. Somebody is saying goodbye, but if anyone else wants to unmute themselves to ask a question, if they don't have time to type, I'll be happy to. I'm sure that Eugenia will be happy to answer. If not, yeah, Pedro, I see that you're.
Thank you very much, Eugenia and Rosi. I would like to ask Eugenia, these relations between the leisure and the museum. The range of the book is from the late 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century, and it's a period of many changes in the Spanish society. You have shown how the bourgeois, the upper middle classes, how those closed spaces for leisure, how, I mean, it's one of the topics, big topics of the book, but how can we also see the evolution of those spaces, if there is any evolution in the period scope of the book? Those spaces where, let's say, that the social class was marked and where the lower class was excluded.
Yeah, oh, thank you for this question. I don't want to run out of time here, but so it's one of the main threads of the book. The question is very important because Madrid, right, develops from the sort of backward bureaucratic center into this modern capital, and the development of the leisure zones is a part of this story. And it's, in general, it's the story of modernization and modernity that happened differently in societies that were sort of second wave of modernity, right, a non-traditional modernity. And the Prado was important right there because it was initially the center of this old regime pastimes. So anybody could come and go at any times, anybody could sleep there for, you know, and it was known, it's captured. Then during the day, people could walk, at night, people would come and sleep, and it was fine. And then as this zone became, oh yeah, it was actually also the center of sex trafficking and yeah, etc. There was a place where people would be robbed and the corpses were dumped, etc. So this kind of space. And then as time went by, it became more and more decent because it also in 1915, they built the Ritz Hotel, and then they built the high rises right behind the museum. And so the zone needed to be better known. So as I found, there were concierges of those high rise buildings even put Vaseline on the benches to prevent people from sleeping, etc. So that was the story of the area around the Prado, is the story of transformation of the leisure activities and development of alternative activities on the museum. And, you know, as my book ends, this was the space in front of the museum was reserved for book fair initially. So again, there was still a leisure, but of the more educated type. So yeah, revisiting the history of the Prado and of Spain in general through the prism of the evolution of urban and also rural leisure is a great topic of research. There is some research that Jorge Urria is doing from Asturias, right? But this is definitely an under-researched topic.
Okay, we have one quick question that actually just as a specification, it says, you say gated spaces, and ZB asks, how did people gain access?
By paying. So if you couldn't pay, you could not get in. And this was how the bourgeois could secure that unpaying people who could not pay would not come in.
All right. John asked a little bit more of the story of the Prado during the Guerra Civil. But I don't know if we have time. I think we're gonna ask John to go read that last section of the book, which is an amazing account of what takes place. I'm gonna thank here Eugenia for her time, her work, her book. I really suggest everyone to go read it. You can find it in paperback, you can find it in English and in Spanish. It's really an entertaining, And in Russian, okay.
Yes, you can also find it in Russian if that's what you read.
That's good. I won't be reading it in Russian, but I'm sure that some of our listeners could. Thank you again, Instituto Cervantes and Pedro Jesus, for hosting us. Thank you, everyone, for spending this afternoon with us. And we hope to see you next time, where we'll be talking about childhood and early contemporary Spain. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you, Rosi, for your questions.